asked my wife as I was coming down whether she could think of a joke. She said, if they look at the top of your head, they'll laugh.
Everywhere, new technology and communication brings men and nations closer together. The concerns of one inevitably become the concerns of all. And our new closeness is stripping away the false masks, the illusion of differences, which is the root of injustice and of hate and of war. This world demands the qualities of youth, not a time of life, but a state of mind, a temper of the will, a quality of the imagination, a predominance of courage over timidity, of the appetite for adventure over the life of ease. Those with the courage to enter the conflict will find themselves with companions in every corner of the world. It would be a world which demanded of each government that it accept its responsibility to ensure social justice. It would be a world of constantly accelerating economic progress, not material welfare as an end in of itself, but as a means to liberate the capacity of every human being to pursue his talents and to pursue his hopes. It would, in short, be a world that we would all be proud to have built. We must do this not because it is economically advantageous, although it is, not because the laws of God command it, although they do. We must do it for the single and fundamental reason that it is the right thing to do. Moral courage is a rarer commodity than bravery in battle or great intelligence. It is the one essential, vital quality for those who seek to change the world, which yields most painfully to change. Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Few will have the greatness to bend history, but each of us can work to change a small portion of the event, and in the total, all of these acts will be written in the history of this generation.
I welcome this kind of examination.
I am paying for this microphone.
What difference does it make?
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
I'm just a patsy.
Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war.
Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there.
We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
The United States is owned by foreign corporations. Do you really care? And if anybody cares, they're considered crazy.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
Man, all the humanity and all
the controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
An unspeakable tragedy. Dead on arrival.
And I will go to my grave being at peace about it.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Don't give up. Don't ever give up.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hi, this is Shane O'Sullivan. You're listening to the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, the court historians, and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 072, Lisa Pease and the Life and Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. Now, our guest tonight is researcher Lisa Pease, who'll join us next in the Midnight Hour. So to clean the castle a little bit, we haven't released an episode in about 2 weeks because the Midnight Rider News HQ has been moved. Now everything was boxed up, so no access. And I must tell you all that on my list of things I despise doing, moving has to be in the top 5, which is why I try not to do it often. But we're settled in now. The microphone is on, the lights are dimmed, the clock is ticking on the best side of midnight, and we're honored to be with you all. So we'll be right back with Lisa Pease. On episode 005 of the Midnight Writer News Show, we were honored to have one of the leading JFK assassination researchers on the show. Jim DiEugenio of KennedysandKing.com joined us to discuss his interests into the JFK assassination research community, the case and trial of Jim Garrison, Oliver Stone's JFK, the poor JFK-related work done by Vincent Bugliosi and Tom Hanks, the 2017 JFK records releases, as well as comments on James Files, the Three Hobos, and whether he believes it was Rafael Cruz in New Orleans with Lee Harvey Oswald. Listen to Jim DiEugenio on episode 005 of the Midnight Writer News Show today. Spartacus Educational has called Lisa Pease an information activist. Now, we know her best as the co-editor of Probe magazine from 1995 to 2000, as well as the co-editor with Jim DiEugenio of 2003's The Assassinations. So for anyone on Twitter, Lisa is an active and interesting follow, so check her out there. But we wanted to have her on tonight for 2 current reasons. One, she has a book forthcoming in November, and it's a great title, A Lie Too Big to Fail, The Real History of the Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. But also, she received 2 mentions in the new RFK Jr. book, and we'll get right into that. So let's welcome to the show for the first time, Lisa Pease. How are you this evening, Lisa?
Oh, I'm good. How are you?
I am well, and thanks so much for being on. Now, you've done some fascinating work over the years, and I'd like to start by asking you about what has been stunning yet refreshing news. That is the RFK Jr. book. Now, your name is mentioned twice, both times regarding the question of whether or not John or Robert Kennedy had any knowledge of the CIA's assassination plots against Fidel Castro. Now, as we know, journalist Seymour Hersh, by way of Mark Halperin, says yes, but you provided RFK Jr. with a report saying no, absolutely not. Yeah. So for those who may not know, who's Mark Halperin and what did this report say?
Well, what I don't know is Mark Halperin the son of Sam Halperin?
Oh, I'm sorry,
the guy
Sam. Yes,
who
Sam.
was Richard Helms' deputy, who has lied to pretty much everybody about the Kennedy's role in the Castro assassination plots. When I first saw that, I didn't know if it was true or not. I thought, I'm going to find out. And if the Kennedys really did authorize these plots, I'm going to say so. And if they didn't authorize these plots, I'm going to say so. And so I really dug into it, and I looked at every book that claimed the Kennedys had killed Castro or authorized the plots to kill Castro, and I would look for where did they get this from? And almost always it was Sam Halperin. And again, Sam Halperin was a deputy to Richard Helms, for whom a very top-secret report was written. In 1967, the Castro plots were exposed. All right, and it looks like Johnny Roselli probably leaked it to the press, probably through one of his associates, because Johnny Roselli, who had been involved in the assassination plots against Castro, had been charged in a card cheating scandal here in, a card cheating scandal here in Beverly Hills. And while he was in jail, he was trying through Bill Harvey, who was a good friend of his, trying to pressure the CIA into coming to his defense. And, he had done operations with the CIA, including trying to kill Castro. And so I think he was the one who leaked it to the press, and the CIA went into damage control. And they wrote this internal report, an Inspector General report, that's really a damage control report. And they basically say that. And they're trying to figure out who knows what's been made public, what's true about what's been made public, and what's false about what's been made public. And in their own report, they go through the Drew Pearson column that first exposed this, and when they come to the part where they said the Kennedys authorized the plot, the CIA indicates, that's not true. They knew that. They knew it's right, black and white. They have like a column of what was said, what was true or not true. And they say that's not true. And then they reiterate this and explain it at the very end of this same report. And the report's less than a couple of 100 pages long, but it seems very few people have actually read it or much less understood it. And in the end, the report basically asks, it's the CIA asking itself this question: can CIA claim that it had executive authority for the plots? And they answer their own question, not in this case. And they explain. They said, when the plots were exposed, we went and we told Robert Kennedy only about the plots that had ended. We did not tell him about the plots that were continuing. And so this notion that the Kennedys approved the plots is provably wrong. The CIA has admitted it's wrong. Now, that's not quite the end of the story, because the CIA has tried very hard to sprinkle the record and surface documents that make it look like, despite that, the Kennedys really did know and approve of the plots. And there are examples of this at the maryfarrell.com site, where all the, or .org, I guess, where the JFK files and Church Committee files and Watergate investigation, there are a lot of files that are posted online there. And if you search, certain things, you will find documents that make it look like these Cubans were talking to Bobby Kennedy about killing Castro. But here's the thing. If you keep reading those documents, if you follow the train on every single one of those documents, you will eventually come to the point where somebody says, yeah, that guy just made that up. And I'm serious, this happened like over and over. I actually put together a whole hour-long presentation on this that I gave at Dr. Gary Aguilar's house in San Francisco. I had a target audience of one for this, and my target audience was John Newman, because I had just heard him speak at a conference in Bethesda, Maryland, where we were both at, where he was basically operating from the premise that the Kennedys had authorized the plots, and that one of the plots was turned around and used against the Kennedys. Now, I do think it's very likely that one of the Castro plots was turned around and used against John Kennedy, but there's really no good evidence, all right, that the Kennedys ever supported these plots. And here's the thing, the CIA knew they wouldn't support the plots. That's why they only told them about the plots that had ended. There would be no reason to withhold the plots that were continuing if the Kennedys were supportive of those plots. There'd be no reason to hide. So anyway, so in all the books, that followed, this particular bit of information was revealed. The Church Committee did, in a footnote, mention that the CIA had asked and answered its own question, no, in this regard. But it's buried in a footnote because really who controlled the Church Committee in the end? It was an epic battle between our elected government and our unelected government. And I hate to tell your viewers, listeners, but the unelected government won. The Church Committee was ultimately overpowered by the CIA, and they were not able to press for the reforms and get what they wanted. And the report was watered down, and plots the CIA had provably been involved in were, distanced. Because here's how the CIA works. The CIA doesn't have office employees that don guns and run into the field and kill foreign leaders. That's not how it works. All right? It might be what it looks like on TV, but that's really not how it works. The people who sit, in the CIA's offices, those are desk officers. And then there are the control officers who are out in the field. And then they develop assets. And then those assets develop assets. So the ones that the CIA employees directly develop are called cutouts. And then those cutouts, people like Robert Mayhew, who, no formal office at CIA, but under contract to the CIA. So, you can call him a cutout, but he's being paid by the CIA. People like Mayhew then go hire somebody like Johnny Roselli, who is now 2 steps removed from the CIA, because he's not a CIA employee and he's not directly being controlled by a CIA employee. He's basically being controlled by a CIA contractor. And that's how the CIA is able then to say, well, we didn't kill this foreign leader. It was, this other guy who did it. But if you follow that guy back up the chain, it's a direct CIA link. And, I think in a criminal court, those people would be guilty of murder.
Correct.
They'd be guilty of participating in the conspiracy because the chain is provable. But the Church Committee waffled on this and basically said, no, we didn't kill Lumumba. No, we didn't kill, the guy in Chile. No, we didn't kill these other guys. Always some other people did, although the CIA had pretty much promoted it and organized it, but they didn't actually kill it. And I thought that was a huge cop-out, and history will not look favorably on that. But anyway, so in this report, this little footnote admits to the fact that the CIA knew the Kennedys didn't know about the Castro plots. And Sam Halpern goes around and tells everybody the opposite. Nope, Kennedys knew, they were in on it, they supported it. When we told him, he never said not to do it. And that's bullshit. Again, Robert Kennedy actually asked for documentation in writing from the CIA This is referred to in an article, ironically, by Cy Hirsch, quoting two of Kennedy's aides. And, the rebuttal, of course, is, well, that's what his friends say, but, Kennedy's not dead. I mean, Kennedy's not around to tell the truth anymore. Well, when Kennedy was alive, he was still alive in 1967 when this first hit the news. And he's like, I can't believe people are accusing me of killing Castro. He says, I'm the one who saved his life, which is true. That Robert Kennedy found out that Bill Harvey had sent these sabotage teams into Cuba at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Can you imagine? I mean, the world is poised at the brink of nuclear war, and some cowboy is sending in what may well have been assassination squads, to really upset the situation. And Bobby Kennedy finds out about this, and he is livid. And Bill Harvey is one strong, angry, alpha dude, and Robert Kennedy cows him. He tries to explain himself, and Bobby's like, I'll give you 3 minutes to explain yourself. After 3 minutes, he gets up and leaves the room, and Bill Harvey's still trying to talk. And Bill Harvey's like, oh, no, I got permission from the Pentagon. And Bobby's like, I already talked to the Pentagon. And they said that's not true. I mean, he knew he was lying. And so there's this huge battle between the CIA and the Kennedys. They were not working together. In fact, that's why John Kennedy, President Kennedy, set up the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, to prevent the CIA from running its own covert operations. They wanted them done through the strict military chain of command where somebody had to sign off on any covert operation, none of these little terrorist cell-type organizations that were going on at the time. And so that's what really happened. So, of course, the historical record has to be rewritten, because if the Kennedys ordered the Castro plots, then the Kennedys really aren't the good guys, and they are in cahoots with the CIA, and then why would the CIA have killed either one of them? And that's what people need to understand. These lies have a purpose. It's not just to smear the Kennedys, it's to hide the CIA's involvement in their deaths. Because, again, if you believe they're working hand in hand, there would literally be no motive for the CIA to kill the Kennedys if they had the same worldview, the same global agenda. But they didn't. So people like Sam Halpern, and you mentioned Mark Halpern, and I don't know who that is. So if I can only assume it's a relative of Sam Halpern, who, like I said, was the chief disinformationist on all of this. And Cy Hirsch is one of these people whose sources have always been the CIA. Sometimes he's told the truth because of that. A lot of times he's told bullshit because of that. And the sad thing is you never know which of Cy Hirsch's stories are true unless you dig a little further. For example, he did write that the chemical weapons in Syria were not used by the Syrian government. And I believe that to be true from my research. I read the CIA's report. I read, other reports, the UN report, and it really sounds like it came from the Western-backed rebels. Yes, poison gas was used, but it was not used by the Syrian government on its people. It was used by the rebels to implicate the Syrian government. It was a false flag operation. And so, like I said, I don't want to paint Cy Hirsch with too broad a brush, because he has told some important stories, like the one about Bobby Kennedy getting and writing this stuff. But that particular story, is just bullshit. The Kennedy, and so anyway, I got to meet Bobby Kennedy. He is now a resident of the Los Angeles area. I've been to his house. David Talbot was the one who first introduced us, which was really cool. There was something Bobby was looking into, and David didn't know who knew about it. And he's like, what do you know about this guy? I'm like, hey, we wrote a probe article about him. Send him to me. I'll tell him about it. And so, I got on the phone with him, and we had a few conversations, and then he invited me over for lunch. And that was, can you imagine, as somebody who's researched the Kennedys and the assassinations for 25 years, the chance to actually talk to not only a member of the family, but in my mind, the leading member of the family, the one who has most followed in the tracks of his father and his uncle, and to find that he actually cared about knowing the truth about both the assassinations and the Castro plots. And we didn't talk about the Castro plots at that lunch, but afterwards, when I wrote him a thank you, I said, and P.S., by the way, your father never ordered the Castro plots. And he wrote back, thank you, Lisa, exclamation point, exclamation point. And then when I talked to him another time, he said he had personally looked into that for years, because he too was really curious and willing to tell the truth either way. And he'd even gone and interviewed Castro in Cuba. And he was absolutely convinced his father had not been involved in the plot. So that was kind of an instant bonding moment for us both, because we both knew then that the other had done their homework on that. And so anyway, he had me over to his house a second time, a research section. He was working on his book, which is now out, American Values, and I brought him those pages and other documents, for his use. And so, yeah, when he mentioned me in his book, I wrote him, I texted him, it's like, I'm going to love you forever for putting me in your book. Yeah, I was an instant celebrity at my workplace. I put copies of the pages on my desk so everybody walking by is like, what? Are you kidding? You're mentioned in a book by a Kennedy? Oh, my God.
Nice.
So that was very cool. But like I said, beyond cool, it was really important that those of us who are trying to tell the truth connect to each other. So it was kind of inevitable that Bobby and the community would eventually connect, because he is a good guy and he does care about the truth and he is searching. And I want to say one thing about, and his sister, Kathleen, I'm going to screw up her name, but Kathleen anyway, has now backed him in calling for reopening of the Robert Kennedy assassination. We'll come back to that. But I want to say one thing about the family members who are not supporting calls for reinvestigation, because I want to defend them too. They were very young. I mean, none of them were in their 20s when their father was killed. They were very young. And it was a completely traumatic event for them. And all of them suffered in different ways. For Rory, it's really painful. I actually met her at a film screening once that I said I was working on a book about her father, and this look of pain just came across her face. And I felt horrible for having mentioned it. And she just said kind of flatly, she's like, I never knew my father. And, so how can we expect her to, take up the charge when just the mention of him brings that much pain? Because she didn't. She was literally in the womb when he was killed and wasn't born until after he was dead. And how sad is that, to be born into a grieving family like that? So I think we have to cut them a lot of slack. This is intensely personal to them in a way that it's not to the rest of us. To the rest of us, it's a matter of history and righteousness and this and that. But to them, it's intensely personal. And honestly, we have to allow each member of the family to respond and react in the way that's appropriate to who they are. All of them are trying to do good things in the world. None of them are sitting back and just, eating cake, it's on some remote island. I mean, they're all working hard for justice. And I just can't say enough. It's like, back off. The family is doing what they can in all their various ways. And God bless Bobby Kennedy for coming forward. That is just huge. It's super important. The timing, of course, he came out right before the 50th anniversary. And so that actually created kind of a several-day news cycle. I think it was May 31st when Tom Jackman wrote a really good article in the Washington Post that was then quoted and requoted and sometimes responded to in terribly awful ways. Dan Moldea, for example, wrote a response where he really put Kennedy down, and Dan Moldea doesn't have a leg to stand on. I have to tell you, Dan Moldea had promised to exclude a part of his book that was not true. He said at the start of his book on the Robert Kennedy case, he said, I checked every quote in this book with Sirhan, and he approves of all the quotes. And then he ends his book with a quote that Sirhan never saw, never checked, and denies ever having said. And there were witnesses to the conversation between Moldea and Sirhan, where they also were able to say, no, that quote was never put forward. And then Lynn Mangan, who was a researcher helping Sirhan at the time, had actually written to Dan Moldea and said, I don't even think the quote is real. Why don't you provide me a signed statement from the guy who claims he heard it? And that's the point where Moldea finally wrote Lynn and said, well, I've decided not to include that quote in my book. And then he did anyway. So I'm sorry, Moldea is a provable liar, and I have those documents. I have the signed letter from Moldea saying that. If anybody doesn't believe it, I'm happy to send them a copy. All right, it is just shocking. It's like how this guy has any credibility. I mean, his book alone should have shot his credibility in the foot. He wrote a book that 9/10 of it is really good. It goes into a lot of really excellent evidence of conspiracy. And then he kind of pulls this about face and goes, but if this were true, that meant the LAPD lied. Oh, shocker! The police would never lie. And like, oh my God, I go to jury duty.
It's the LAPD. It's what they do.
Exactly. It's like the LAPD has been in federal receivership for 8 years because they're so freaking dishonest.
Amazing.
So it's like, how could he be that naive? And then you have to wonder, is it naivety? Does he serve another master? I don't know. But anyway.
Right, and as you explained earlier, he could be a guy who works for a guy who works for the guy.
Right.
So, and I wanted to explain that I mistakenly said Mark Halper, and he's the co-author of the book Game Change, so I must have been thinking about that, so my mistake. But regarding the Kennedy family, I did see where Kathleen had backed RFK Jr., but I also saw a speech by Joe III where he was more tepid, and I might even say more political about his answer. But Lisa, I guess this community was really just hoping for that moment, that time when the Kennedy family, after JFK and after RFK and after Chappaquiddick and after the Michael Skakel case and the Castro allegations, as you explained earlier, and then the blame for Marilyn Monroe's murder, after all of these things, I think the assassination and deep state research community was really hoping that this was the time when the Kennedys would stand up in unison and say, this is enough. We aren't taking this anymore.
Right. And like I said, I just think it's really important that, again, people aren't in their shoes, and so it's really, we can't judge what they do. They may feel they're going to lose donors to their charities that they've spent so much of their lives building. They may feel, Joe Kennedy Jr. the third or whatever may feel he can't run for president if he comes out and says this, and he might feel he could do a lot of good if he became president. Remember that John Kennedy didn't really speak out against the Vietnam War publicly, even though he was trying to end it privately, because he knew he needed to get reelected to truly end it. Robert Kennedy didn't speak out about Jack's death because he knew unless he was president, he would not be able to fully investigate it. So it's like everything they do is strategic, and we just have to assume they are operating from their best motives and their morality and not question it. You know what I mean? I understand the desire to have them all come forward. And it was funny, I attended an event with Paul Schrade and at the Robert Kennedy Schools, which is the site of the old Ambassador Hotel. The place was mostly torn down, but the Ambassador Ballroom was preserved and turned into a library for the kids. And there's actually a beautiful mural on one side that has Robert Kennedy in a sea of hands and arms reaching to him, and every hand and arm in the picture is an actual photo of a real activist hand. And Paul Schrade was able to show me which one was his hand. And he said Dolores Huerta's hand is up there, and a number of other local activists were in that picture, which was cool. Right. And so Paul Schrade was explaining what it's like dealing with the Kennedy family. He's like, you'd think you get one of them, because he was trying to get the Kennedy family's support to turn the old Ambassador Hotel into this set of schools. And he got Max Kennedy on board fairly quickly. And he thought, great, I'm done, thinking Max would then go, organize a family get-together, and they'd all agree and sign on. And he goes, what you have to understand is that every Kennedy is different. They all run their own lives. They don't agree with each other. They don't have big family get-togethers like that. It's just a bunch of individual separate people, like most people's family. Some people are very close to siblings. Some people aren't close at all to their siblings. And, that's true in every family. And so Paul was talking about what a challenge it was, because he literally had to go to every single Kennedy individually and lobby each one individually. And so, that's kind of what would have to happen in the RFK case too. If we want them all on board, somebody would have to literally lobby each one of them individually. And Bobby doesn't have that kind of time. I mean, he's more focused on trying to get the case reopened, so I understand.
So if Richard Helms apparently kept the last surviving copy of this report in his own safe, which I heard that he did, how was it ever released to the public?
Yeah, well, most people don't know. There was a novel written about this report. This report was so secret, the CIA wouldn't even share it with Nixon. And because Richard Nixon and the CIA were very much at war with each other, which is something people don't understand, especially since the CIA kind of put Nixon in office by killing Robert Kennedy. So why aren't they on the same page? But I think it goes back to something that happened in the Indonesian effort in 1957. I've not really gotten to the bottom of that, but the CIA kind of had a long-standing grudge against Nixon. So anyway, they did not trust him, and so they would not. He wanted to see the Castro report. They'd prepared it for LBJ at his, request, and they did show it to him. But when Nixon asked for it, the CIA just wouldn't share it with him. Period. It's like, never mind that you're president. Sorry, you're not. You're not the classification level. You don't have the right clearance for this. And this is, again, people need to understand, this is how the CIA thinks. They literally think they are more powerful than the president. And frankly, they are, because no one has ever taken them to account or brought them down from that perch. And that's why, sadly, a lot of my friends are like, well, Trump's horrible, but the CIA will take care of him. Don't worry about that. And I'm like, what? It's a democracy. It's like, I don't want Trump either, but I don't want the CIA to bring him down. I want democracy to bring him down. I want the citizens to bring him down. I don't want this to happen from behind the scenes. That's not how it's supposed to happen. And I don't want to have to trust that, the secret agency will always do the right thing. So, because frankly, again, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Well, right, and the vitriol in some of these statements made online is frankly frightening, to be honest, and we should all hope that democracy works in the way that it was meant to. Now, I'm not pro-Trump, and I'm not anti-Trump. As I've said multiple times on the show, I've voted third party since 1996, but we have to all hope that the process works at some point. So as I said before, you're mentioned twice in the RFK Jr. book, and the second time your name appears, it's in regard to an organized CIA plot to smear both John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. So please tell us a little bit about this plot.
Yeah, Jim DiEugenio, who I know has been a guest on your show, wrote a really good two-part series on the posthumous assassination of John Kennedy. And he showed how, like Judith Miller and some other characters, and even the Marilyn Monroe story, were twisted to be used against the Kennedys. No one's saying that the Kennedys were saints or never slept around. No one's saying that. But a lot of the stories about their sexcapades have been completely falsified. In fact, I have a friend in San Diego, a lawyer, who has been working for years to disprove nearly everything in C. David Heyman's many books on the Kennedys. He wrote dozens of books, several on the Kennedys, and he just made up these bullshit incidents of all their sex stories, because if one's true, then all the others are plausible, right? And he literally invents people that never existed. She's been able to prove this. I mean, she's just an amazing, amazing researcher. She puts most of the Kennedy researchers to shame. And she has a website that she's going to launch, and I can't wait. I'll definitely let you know when it goes live. But she's got so much documentation. She went to see David Heyman's archives because, he would tell people, oh, it's on the, he would interview people who had died. And it's like, can we believe him because that person's now dead? And when I read one of his books, it's like everybody spoke with the same voice. And I've studied screenwriting, and I used to be an actor, and, different people speak differently. They have different patterns of speech. And in C. David Heyman's books, they all sound like the same nasty old mid-40s male, Like,
hey, now I'm a mid-40s male.
Young woman, old woman, doesn't matter. So anyway, so I was highly suspicious, and I wrote an article, very critical of them, but she really went and got the nuts and bolts to prove this stuff was fabricated. So she has contributed to that. Jim DiEugenio has contributed to that. It's not like I can give you a CIA code name for an organized plot. I don't mean it in that way. I'm just saying there is a broad pattern of the CIA looking to smear the Kennedys. Because again, if the Kennedys are these awful sex hounds, who cares who killed them? That's the point. Every smear against Kennedy, in fact, that whole Skakel murder trial, I felt like that was an attempt to smear the Kennedys, because they always said Kennedy cousin, Michael Skakel. It's like, he's not even from the Kennedy line, he's from the Skakel line. Like that was, Ethel Kennedy, it's the line that married into the Kennedy family. but anything to smear the Kennedys, even if it meant putting an innocent man behind bars. And Bobby Kennedy wrote a really good book showing that Michael Skakel was, in fact, innocent and did have a solid alibi, and that his lawyers basically, blew the case for him. And, he did eventually, get released. So they're just, again, people, you just can't believe what you read in the papers. And sadly, you can't even believe what you read as as we were discussing right before the show, nonfiction history books are often very fictional. And I think even as a kid, I kind of got that, because I remember in high school reading history, and it was all like, oh, the revolutionaries were so great, and the Indians were poor and dumb, and, we took them over, and, it's like they weren't poor and dumb. They were rich and happy, and we just totally obliterated them, and shoved them off their land. And even as a kid, I just knew that history was wrong, and that's one of the reasons I had no interest in pursuing it. I never wanted to be a historian because it seemed so fake and phony and out of touch with reality. And it really wasn't until I got into the John Kennedy assassination where I started that I started to see that, wow, this is history that actually makes sense and explains why the world is so messed up now, and it explains why the media is so bad, and it explains why history books are so bad. They're very powerful people who understand that information is power, and that, truth, the truth really will set us free, and so they don't give us the truth. They give us lies to keep us enslaved, and it's deliberate, and it's happened to the Kennedys so often, and I was thrilled that Bobby was willing to call that out, and like I said, he's been a lifelong researcher into his family, but not a lifelong researcher into the assassinations per se. But he certainly, the Castro plots were a huge part of his life, and he was really interested in that. So it was cool to be able to share some stuff with him that even through his research he did not know about this report, because it's been very well hidden. And so that one copy that Richard Helms had, so anyway, they wouldn't share it with Nixon. So after Watergate and everyone was deposed, John Ehrlichman wrote a novel, and gosh, I'm trying to think of the name of it. Oh, I don't remember, but in the novel, this report, the report is called the Primula Report. It's got this fancy little name, and it's a huge part of the novel, like what's in the report and why it's so sensitive. And it's, kind of, disguised as a novel, but it's really about the CIA's fight with the White House. So sometimes you can get more history in novels than you can from an actual history book, because it's easier to tell the truth when it's disguised as fiction. So anyway, yeah.
So I'm trying to understand these affairs, Lisa. Now, it's something that I thought about for a long time as both a teacher and a researcher, because I wanted to always try to teach the truth to my students. And I've considered myself an independent for a while. And I know, everyone claims to be an independent, but I really think I am. And the voting record to prove it, I do have. But let me ask you this about the dalliances of the Kennedy men, so to speak. Now, I like JFK and RFK, and I think they were both great American figures.
Right.
But I think there are pro-Kennedy supporters out there, very well-respected ones, who do reflexively deny all of the allegations of affairs. And then I think there are anti-Kennedy people who accept all of them as true. But on both sides of the issue, I just don't know how we know.
And the thing is, like I said, you have to look into every single allegation. And when you see what this is a lawyer who went through all these files. And it's like I said, these allegations are so provably false when you see her data. And I've been urging her to write a book. She worked with, what was his name? David K. Johnson wrote a Newsweek article a few years ago, and she gave him a lot of information for that article, where he exposed just a few of C. David Heyman's lies. But, it was Judy, I want to say Judith Miller, but that's the woman on the weapons of mass destruction. Who am I thinking of? Not Judy Baker. Who's the one I'm thinking of? Who's the mob woman who slept with Kennedy?
You're thinking of Judith Campbell Exner.
That's it. Judy Campbell Exner. Right. So as Jim quoted from one of her interviews, she said at one point, "The government wants me to talk again." She actually said that.
Ugh, that's unbelievable.
It's like, said that in an interview. It's like, you know, it's hard not to see the government's hand in these smears. And again, it's not to say they never had affairs or anything, but again, if 2 are true, it doesn't mean the next 30 are also true. You see what I'm saying? Big difference.
Correct. And we have to remember that this predates the age of technology when everyone seems to be writing these ill-advised texts or emails or private messages to those they maybe shouldn't be. But even today, we still have historians debating whether or not George Washington had an affair with Sally Fairfax and whether or not Sally Hemings had an affair with either Thomas Jefferson or his younger brother Randolph, both of which could explain the DNA links. And we still have questions about FDR and both Lucy Mercer and Missy LeHand.
Right.
And I guess the examples here are actually endless. But again, without photos or video or audio, quote, in the act, unquote, how do we know either way? Because political figures didn't really necessarily write in a way or in a style as blatant as we do today. So even if someone was in the room, so to speak, readers and researchers ideologically or emotionally aligned with a political figure still don't believe that person.
Right. And like I said, but it isn't a matter of belief if the cop who is quoted as, you know, talking about this incident, if that cop never actually existed in real life, that there was never any cop by that name in any region of that state. That's what I mean about the lies. So it's not a he said, she said. It's like completely provable false premise to begin with.
Right. Well, that's understandable.
Yeah. But yeah, I understand. Yeah. If somebody says, well, here's somebody who claims, who claimed she slept with John Kennedy, and I saw this on it wasn't the National Enquirer, but it was one of those rags. And I walked into I can literally remember like the corner of the newspaper where I saw it, and it was Priscilla Johnson McMillan claiming she had slept with John Kennedy, you know, when he was a senator.
Oh my gosh.
And that, for your listeners, Priscilla Johnson McMillan was in her CIA file a witting CIA asset as opposed to the unwitting CIA assets where people don't even know that they're working for the CIA. But she knew. She knew she was working for the CIA. Been a witting asset. She interviewed Oswald when he entered the Soviet Union. There's a document in her file that said, oh, yeah, we can pretty much get Priscilla to write anything we want. And, you know, and there she is claiming she slept with Kennedy. So, again, is that a credible assertion? Here's a CIA woman, not even very attractive, not the kind of, I mean, Kennedy was very attractive. He could have any woman he wanted, pretty much, I think. You know, it's like, would that be the one he would have chosen? I don't think so. I find that really hard to believe. And I find it really easy to believe that she would make that claim and degrade herself for her employer because they said in her own file she can be persuaded to write whatever we want. So there you go.
And what does it say about our media, folks, if the CIA can openly claim that a journalist will write anything they tell her to write? So think about that one as you think about Operation Mockingbird. So before we move on to the dramatic campaign of 1968, I want to sum up the discussion of affairs by asking you if there are any specific affair stories of either JFK or RFK that you do believe.
No, but only because it's not my area of interest. So like I said, I'm not going to pretend that none ever happened. But in Bobby's case, I'm not aware of any credible assertion, which again isn't to say it didn't happen, but of the ones that have been made public, they're easily discredited. And with John Kennedy's case, again, it's like I can't think of one that I find credible, which doesn't mean there aren't. But if you name a couple, I could say why that didn't happen.
Okay, well, let's move on to more important things like the presidential campaign of 1968.
Yeah, that's much more important.
Yes, and this June we saw the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. And it was really at the apex of what was turning into a very consequential presidential run. It was about 3.5 years after his brother had been assassinated in Dallas. Yeah. And I want to ask you, how had Bobby changed or transformed from 1963 to 1968?
Wow. Well, you know, he had gone from literally being on top of the world, you know, helping his brother run the world. You know, John Kennedy really leaned on him, and he was running law enforcement, and he was advising on foreign policy, and he'd gone to Indonesia and, you know, sat down with Sukarno and really trying to do good things in the world and had the power to do good things in the world. And so he not only lost his brother and his job, he lost the power to do that much good in the world. So it's really kind of a triple loss. I think, people don't really understand what a huge shift that was. And maybe I can relate on a very, very small level, because I had worked on Jerry Brown's campaign when he was running for governor. And at the time, it was my sole job. I was paid, and I had a boyfriend that I was crazy about, and I had hope for the country. And so when Jerry lost, it's like I lost my job, I lost my boyfriend, and I lost my hope. And that was a really dark period for me. And that's nothing compared to what Bobby went through. So I get it. It's like, I know what it's like. It's not just losing the brother, which is a horrible enough thing, but it's losing that power to do so much good. You see the yawning gap between what could have been and what is. And it really, first it caused him to turn inward and really seek solace. And I watched some of that Netflix documentary, Bobby Kennedy for President, which details the campaign. There's amazing footage in there. But there are times where he's at an event, he's laughing and he's happy, and then you see him just kind of go into himself, and a really sad look comes across his face, and you just feel like he's probably thinking about his brother. And again, what could have been, what they were about to do for the world. And so that weighed on him, and he originally had no intention of, running for any kind of public office. But with Johnson, it was clear that they were on totally different pages. That was not going to work. They tried to remain friendly because they were both Democrats and high-ranking officials, and but there was really no love between them, and that was really clear. And at the 1964 convention, people can go Google this. That's where Johnson won, of course, the nomination because he'd stepped in as vice president. So it's kind of like it was his to lose. But Bobby Kennedy showed up just to give a speech, and the audience applauded for 20 minutes straight. And Bobby knew it wasn't for him. He knew it was for his dead brother. And he kind of teared up, and he nodded, and he tried to interrupt and start his speech several times, and finally had to wait it out. And they finally brought out gavels to kind of quiet the audience so he could go forward. But that's a really moving thing. But I think that's when maybe he realized he still had power and that he could still do something.
You were there, all of you. And when there were difficulties, you sustained him. When there were periods of crisis, you stood beside him. When there were periods of happiness, you laughed with him. And when there were periods of sorrow, you comforted him. I realize that as an individual, that we can't just look back, that we must look forward. When I think of President Kennedy, I think of what Shakespeare said in Romeo and Juliet, when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he shall make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun. But I realize, as an individual, and really...
And, he did run for Senate in New York and became the senator from New York. And right away, because usually when you're a senator, they expect you to kind of sit back, when it's your first year, it's like, lay low, see what everybody else is doing, don't make too much noise, and once you know the ropes, then kind of speak up. Well, Kenny gets in there, and he speaks up right away about nuclear disarmament and against the war in Vietnam. I mean, he was not shy or reticent or anything, and that really pissed some people off. But again, I think he started to feel that he still had a chance to do the good in the world that he had envisioned doing with his brother. And he really kind of didn't want to run for president that soon. I think he was planning to run in 1972. But then when he saw Johnson falter and Eugene McCarthy beat him in New Hampshire, that was huge. And that's when because Kennedy said, I don't want to split the party. He didn't want to be, to draw a more current parallel, Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, he didn't want to be the spoiler. He didn't want to be the one to split the party. But when he saw the party was already split even without him, then he thought, then I might as well run too. Because he didn't like either of those candidates. He didn't trust Eugene McCarthy to end the war. He certainly knew Johnson wasn't going to end the war, and he really wanted to end the war in Vietnam. And so he stepped in and announced his candidacy. In those days, the primaries were even more of a show than they are today, although after the last election, I think we could also say they were kind of a show. But there was a time in my life where I felt primaries mattered and that candidates were actually chosen at the primaries. But in that time, the delegates were pretty much chosen at the convention, and it didn't matter what people voted in the states. And so Bobby knew it wasn't too late. So even though he'd missed the first few primaries, he joined in March, and then he started winning some. And one of the big ones he won that same night that he won the California primary, he also won Hubert Humphrey's home state. And so there are people alive now who say, oh, he was never going to win the nomination. Hubert Humphrey had it all sewed up. I don't believe that's true. I think the fact that he beat him in his home state was significant. And certainly, the Kennedy name still had a lot of cachet, much more cachet in the Democratic Party then, 3.5 years after his brother's death, than it does today, sadly. So now the Kennedys are almost looked on as like an outsider faction in some parts of the party, thanks to the infiltration of the Southern centrists, the Clintons and others. And so anyway, but grief changed him too. I was going to say grief changes people. If you've ever suffered a loss, it often makes people more compassionate, more sensitive. And Bobby was always a good guy, but I think the grief made him even more in touch with his own humanity, which enabled him to connect to other people. And one of the constant themes at that event I went to with Paul Schrade, where different people were speaking about him, was his ability to connect with people from all levels of life, and that he never treated anybody different, whether they be the busboy or the garbage man or a senator. It's like he gave them all the same amount of respect. And boy, there's one thing I could ask of everybody on the planet, like, please emulate that. Because imagine how much better the world would be if we treated everybody as equals instead of looking at people like, oh, you're less than me, and oh, you're higher than me, I have to kiss up to you. And no, we are all the same. And I was on another radio show recently, and I was talking about how I felt Sirhan was as much a victim as Bobby, and he's like, well, but Bobby's death mattered so much more. It's like, but Sirhan's a person too, and they're both victims. And I don't feel one person is more important than another, and I think Bobby Kennedy would be the first to back me up on that, because that's how he treated everybody, and that everybody matters.
Well, that campaign is significant for many reasons, but I think that what it showed us about Bobby was that he was going to be a different kind of politician and a different kind of man, because he was different. There was a transformation that had occurred, one spurred on by these unchangeable tragedies of life, as well as by age. And lest anyone think that a Robert Kennedy administration would have basically been a JFK Part 2, I think that the Kennedy campaign of 1968 taught us that it would be singularly unique in its own ways, did it not?
Yeah, and it's funny. It was after he lost the Oregon primary. That right around that time, the Martin Luther King tape, the bugging of Martin Luther King had come out in the press, and the spin was that Bobby Kennedy had approved taps on Martin Luther King. Now, the story was much more nuanced than reported, because Bobby Kennedy had approved legal taps on King's office, and the whole point of that was to prove to Hoover that King was not a communist. So Bobby did that knowing it would help Martin Luther King. And I think I remember, and I'd have to go check, but I think he even told King about that. But what Bobby never approved was the taping, the bugging of his hotel rooms and his private, quarters and his bedrooms. That was not what Kennedy approved. But the way the story came out, it just made it sound like, Bobby was this terrible person, and he didn't handle it well because he didn't think he had anything to handle, because he knew he had done the right thing. And that, helped him lose Oregon. But it was after he lost Oregon that he finally, felt free. He was no longer running on his brother's coattails. He wasn't running on the Kennedy name. He was running as Bobby Kennedy, and all his good and bad deeds rolled up into one. And he found that strangely freeing. And so as he came into California, it's like he was probably more himself than ever. And he had become even more radical than John Kennedy in a lot of ways, because he saw that, how do I say, being moderate had not taken them far enough. And so he was much more outspoken on the Vietnam War, because both of them were opposed to the war from the start. Both of them had been to Vietnam in the 50s before the U.S. got involved and had seen the troubles the French had. So, people say, well, Bobby Kennedy was a big supporter of the war. It was more the case that he supported kind of the incremental escalation, hoping it would never get to war. And then once it was war, he didn't want us to just pull out and retreat. It was a more nuanced position than is often presented. It wasn't like he was ever pro-war and then became anti-war. He was anti-war kind of at his core in all aspects, and he had joined, the Navy and was actually looking forward to serving in World War II because he felt that was a just war. Most people, I think, would agree of all the wars that we've had, defeating the Nazis was probably a good cause and worth entering. The world, very few wars have been as justified as that one, I felt.
So he takes Nebraska, and many thought Nebraska was going to be a loss for Kennedy. It was an agricultural state after all. But he takes it by a wide margin.
And I know why, because I heard Pete Edelman talk about this again this weekend. Pete Edelman had been with him in Nebraska, and he'd been on the campaign trail with him. And I think Jeff Greenberg, a reporter, was also there at this event, so it might have been him who said this. But they talked about Nebraska, and they said it was so odd because they expected the liberals and the poor and the blacks to but they didn't expect these middle class whites in these rural areas to like him. And they said what it was even though they didn't agree with him politically, they saw him as a straight shooter. There was absolutely nothing phony about him. They connected to that. They felt he did have core moral values that were important to him, even if they weren't theirs, that he was true to his core moral values, and that he was a fighter, and that no matter what, no one was going to push him around, that he would stand up for what he believed in, and he would be a strong leader, and that's why they voted for him. And I thought that is such an interesting message that Democrats have forgotten. We were able to win those white, moderates in these rural states by being very principled and having a strong message, and that is the audience Bernie Sanders was tapping into, that Hillary could not reach because she's not
likable. She's not likable.
There's a phoniness about her. She's phony. She's phony. I'm sorry. I'm going to call it. All your women, listeners can hate me. But it's she's phony. She's always been phony. She's a neocon. She never should have been in the Democratic Party. She's a Republican at heart. She came from a Republican family. She's good friends with Henry Kissinger, of all people. My gosh. The very architect of the Vietnam War and some horrible atrocities across the planet. This is somebody who is I'd rather die than be a friend of his. And she goes on vacations with him. It's how is she a Democrat? This does not fit. So that's what people in these white rural areas saw. It's Hillary Clinton doesn't fit. She's not the kind of Democrat we're used to. Bobby Kennedy was. And again, even Republicans and conservatives liked him because they felt he was strong, he was principled, even if they weren't their principles. But they felt he would be honest to his principles and not just change with the wind like so many politicians. And they told a funny anecdote when he went to Fresno. Fresno is another white rural county in not in Los Angeles, in Southern California, kind of out in the mountains, in the middle of nowhere, basically. In the middle of Sierras, it's actually very beautiful, but there's no big city there, no big major airports, and so, Kennedy had kind of opened his speech. Most politicians say, oh, it's so great to be here at the Fresno Mall. And, they go on about how great it is to be in that particular place. And Kennedy goes, well, after the pyramids of Egypt and the Taj Mahal, the Great Wall of China, what else was there to visit but the Fresno Mall?
Perfect. Absolutely perfect.
He had a great sense of humor. And it disarmed his audiences immediately. So it's he and his whole family, they have a very good, it's Irish, it's kind of an Irish tradition. It's a self-deprecating humor, too, that he had, that a lot of politicians don't have. because a lot of them are narcissists, and self-deprecation is not something they can do or joke about. But he was not a narcissist, and he was very able to kind of laugh at the trappings of politicking, if you will. So anyway, so he was building up steam, he was building up momentum, and now he rolls into California. And he had actually been at the Ambassador Hotel on June 2nd, and then on June 3rd, he literally covered 1,200 miles and went to events up and down the state. And so by the time he got back to John Frankenheimer's house where he spent the night, he was exhausted. And for your listeners, John Frankenheimer was the director of the film The Manchurian Candidate, about a man who is a soldier who gets hypno-programmed to come back to America and kill somebody, basically, hence the term Manchurian Candidate. And it's just kind of the ultimate irony that Robert Kennedy was sleeping at John Frankenheimer's house that night, because a consultant to that film would later claim he had hypnotized Sirhan. And I don't want to get too far into that.
So after Oregon, we're on to California in June 4th, 1968, a major primary day in the campaign. Now, many may not remember, but it's worth stating here that RFK did lose New Jersey on that day.
Right, but not South Dakota.
Right. He also won South Dakota by a wide margin, a South Dakota, I may add, which is next to McCarthy's Minnesota, and also Hubert Humphrey had been raised in South Dakota.
And he also won the Indian vote and was extremely proud about that because he had actually gone and campaigned at the Native American reservations and was really thrilled that he had won their vote. So, yeah.
Correct. So that was a remarkable win as well. Now, the big news of the day, as we know, was that Kennedy defeats McCarthy in the most crucial of primaries, California, which brings us to the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Now, the victory speech was given so late in the evening that it was now June 5th. Now, I've heard you describe this night so well, so I'm going to leave this up to you. But take us through this late night victory speech and the aftermath.
Ooh, okay. So, June 4th, Robert Kennedy is speaking at the Ambassador Hotel. He comes in to give his speech. It's right about midnight. They finally convince him he's won. The polls are clear enough by that point. He can go down and claim victory. He goes and gives a speech in the embassy ballroom, which is upstairs, even though the hotel sits on a hill. So there's literally two ground levels. There's the upstairs ground level and the downstairs ground level. So the embassy room is kind of on the upstairs ground level. And after his speech, he leaves. He walks into a kitchen pantry en route to the journalists who are holed up in the colonial room. The cameraman had caught him, but the print journalists had to wait till he was done. And at every campaign stop, he had always gone and talked to the print journalists before he went off and done anything else. So although it was kind of a last-minute change for him to walk through the pantry, had anybody thought it through in advance, they would have known that's what he was going to do, because it's what he did at every stop. He always made a point of going and talking to the print journalists. And the most direct route was literally through this little kitchen pantry area. It's only about 20 feet wide or so. It's not a very wide room. I'm kind of guessing that. I could go calculate it, but it's fairly narrow. It's got 3 steam tables on the left. It's got this huge ice machine on the right, which, by the way, had a little gap between the end of the ice machine and a wall partition. It would have been the perfect place for a would-be shooter to hide and not be seen by cameras coming and going through the kitchen. And so Kennedy walks through one of these 2 swinging doors. There's big double doors at the western end. He's walking west to east. He goes about halfway into the room. He's stopping and shaking the hands of all the busboys because, like I said, he treats everybody the same. And one of the last hands he shakes is Juan Romero, who's been much written up in the last weekend. And I got to meet him just on Tuesday the 5th, actually, on the 50th anniversary. I got to give him a hug. And he was the one who put a rosary in Kennedy's hand after he was shot. But I'm getting ahead of the story. So Juan's shaking his hand, and Kennedy turns to move forward being in the easterly direction. And all of a sudden, this young man steps out and fires a gun at Kennedy. The young man is named Sirhan Sirhan. He's about 5'4", 24 years old, curly black hair. A lot of people thought he looked Hispanic, but in fact he was a Palestinian. And he shoots. Kennedy goes down. Paul Schrade goes down. Elizabeth Evans goes down. Two other people, Ira Goldstein and William Wiesel, go down. There were 5 other people wounded with bullets, as well as Kennedy, during the shooting. All right, and Sirhan is grabbed right away, literally after the second shot, by Karl Jucker, one of the maitre d's, a big burly German man who slams him into the steam table and especially tries to point the gun away from people and keep the gun positioned where it can't hurt anybody, because everybody assumes he's firing real bullets, and they don't know how many bullets are in the gun. The gun could only hold 8, but Jucker swears that he did this after the second shot. In the trial, he actually says after the third shot. But here's the problem. There were 4 shots in Kennedy. All the shots came from behind Kennedy, and all the witnesses put Sirhan in front of Kennedy. Now, there's some who say Kennedy had his side to Sirhan, but the shot angles would still, Kennedy would literally have to be walking backwards for Sirhan to have shot him where he was supposed to have shot him. And Dan Mulday and others have charged that, Sirhan just lunged at the senator. Well, even if he lunged at him, he didn't lunge around behind him. He lunged at him from the front. It doesn't make any sense. And Kennedy literally threw his hands up in front of his face, and a number of witnesses saw that. So obviously Kennedy himself perceived the threat as coming from his front. He didn't throw his hands up behind his head. He threw his hands up in front of his head, because that's where the shooter, was seen. So there's chaos, and people, Rosie Greer and a few others actually grabbed Sirhan to protect him, because they were so worried after what had happened in Dallas that Sirhan would be killed. So they were trying to keep people from killing him and keeping people from pummeling him. I mean, some people were so angry they just wanted to go up and bang on him. And, there was this huge mess, and no one really knew what had happened. Obviously, Sirhan had fired and Kennedy had gone down. It was really easy to draw a cause and effect there, right? I'm convinced now that Sirhan was firing blanks, and I will not be able to defend that on this radio show. But in my book, I think people will understand if they read the evidence. My book is coming out this fall. It's called A Lie Too Big to Fail. It'll be out in November, sadly. It'll be out actually on Robert Kennedy's birthday, November 20th. Kind of chilling and sad to me. That was my publisher's choice. Not how I would have wanted to remember that particular anniversary. But anyway, so Sirhan is taken to the police station and questioned, and the sheriffs actually got into the pantry before the LAPD, and this is not widely known, but there was a IBM machine counting the votes for that election. It was literally the first time computers had been used to count a primary election or to count any election in California, and they were at a building across the street from the Ambassador Hotel. So they were fairly nearby, and when shots were fired, they came running over, and they secured the scene first. And in fact, there are bullet holes that are circled and initialed by sheriff's deputies who evidently removed bullets from the walls, after the shooting. And there was a crime reporter who had been flown out from Chicago, who talked to a couple of the LAPD cops in the pantry, in some early morning hour. I'm assuming this would have been probably around 5 a.m. or so. It'd be pretty much as early as I could imagine him getting there, maybe 4 a.m. And he was told that 2 bullets had been removed from a piece of molding that had been pulled off the center divider between the swinging doors. All right. If any bullets were found in the wall or in the door frame, that was more bullets than Sirhan's gun could handle, because 1 bullet was taken from each of the 5 victims, 2 bullets were removed from Kennedy, and the LAPD had already acknowledged and publicly photographed at least 3 bullet holes in the ceiling. And so they decided that 1 bullet in the ceiling, 2 of the holes represent a bullet going into and back out of the ceiling. It had gone up into the ceiling, hit something, ricocheted back down, and must have ended up in one of the other victims. And then the 3rd hole had to be explained by the bullet going up and staying in the ceiling. So that's how the police kind of explained the 8 bullets that Sirhan's gun could hold. But that's why the police then had to deny that there were any additional bullet holes in the pantry. So despite there being pictures of bullet holes and FBI pictures that labeled them bullet holes, not possible or probable, but actual bullet holes. And the LAPD was so concerned about this that in the 70s, they actually wrote the FBI and said, if you had labeled them possible bullet holes, we could ignore this whole matter. But you didn't. You called them bullet holes. And if those are really bullet holes, we should be looking for another shooter. It was almost like they were begging the FBI to please say they were just possible or probable. And to my knowledge, and I don't know of any other researcher who can contradict this, there's never been an FBI response to that particular request, to identify that. And it makes sense because the FBI is in a horrible position, because if they say they really were bullet holes, then why didn't the FBI cry out conspiracy right away? And if the FBI says, well, they weren't bullet holes, then they have to say, our guys don't know what they're doing, and everybody we talk to is wrong, and former agents, shouldn't be on the job, and it's a sticky situation either way. This is the problem when you lie. It's like you have to keep lying to cover up your lie. And so anyway, there were way more bullets, and there was somebody, Kennedy was shot from behind the right ear at a distance of not more than an inch, that particular shot. The other shots of his body were at a distance of not more than 3 inches. All of them came from behind him and to the right, so to speak, but more behind than to the right, if that makes sense. And there was a man who was holding Kennedy's left elbow right elbow with his left hand, and that was Thane Eugene Cesar, a security guard for Ace Security, who, one witness said, absolutely, he said, I know that guard fired his gun. I saw him fire his gun. Of course, the guard completely denied firing his gun, and then he sold his gun after the assassination, but told people he had sold it before the assassination. And we know that's a lie because there's a gun receipt of sale that has the date after the assassination. And when he sold the gun, he told the guy he was selling it to there might be a problem with this gun. That gun then just had a very interesting journey, because after he sold it to that gun was stolen and thrown in a swamp and later dredged up by a film crew and then brought back and ostensibly tested against bullets that were in the California State Archives to prove that Caesar's gun really didn't fire the bullets that killed Kennedy. But this is where the story gets even trickier, because the bullets that are in the archives now do not appear to be the bullets that were actually retrieved from Kennedy at the time. And we know this because in the grand jury, they had Thomas Noguchi, the coroner, examine the bullet that he had pulled from Kennedy, and he says, yes, this is the same bullet, and I know this because I put my initials TN, Thomas Noguchi, and the last 2 digits of the autopsy case number, 31, on the base of the bullet. And he said, you can clearly see the TN31 here. It's very clear to see. That was at the grand jury immediately, after the assassination. Well, 8 years later, 7 years later, 9 years later, 9 years later in 75. I am not doing
You're right.
math
That's fine.
7 years later. In 1975, CBS and Paul Schrade had been pressing to retest the bullets in the case and retest the gun and, find out was one gun used, was more than one gun used, because Bill Harper, a criminalist from Pasadena, who was also a former OSS member, I learned, and had deep connections in the LA police force for that reason, because a lot of the OSS guys ended up going into police services around the country. Harper had written an affidavit saying it's clear that the bullets don't match each other, and therefore at least 2 guns were used, and it's clear from the evidence that at least 2 firing positions were used, because bullets went into victims from the front, which would have been Sirhan's position, but the bullets in Kennedy came from behind him. And so it was clear there were 2 shooters standing in 2 different places. And so based on Harper's evidence, Paul Schrade wanted a reinvestigation. CBS joined Paul Schrade, and a judge ordered a panel of forensic experts to re-examine the evidence. And so the first thing they did is they inventoried all the bullets. And they said, okay, here's a test bullet, and it has these markings on it, and this bullet has these markings on it, and this bullet has these markings on it. And the thing is, although they carefully inventoried what they had so they would all know when they're handling the bullet exactly which bullet it was, what none of them thought to do was to go back and compare those markings to the markings that were recorded in the police evidence log when all those bullets were first turned into inventory. Because every time a bullet was turned in, the markings on that bullet were listed in the evidence log. And so that's why we know that the Kennedy bullet should have had TN31 on it. Instead, the one the panel examined said DWTN. And it did not say DWTN31 because we're looking at something that's about the size of a pencil eraser. All right, so you can imagine, if you can get TN31 on there, you can't really get DW on there, too. It's just there's not that much room and still have it legible. You know, they're not doing this with a microscope. They're just scratching it in, you know. So DWTN is a different bullet. And this happened with two of the other bullets, because the panel was able to match three bullets to each other. They were never able to match any of the bullets. And by that I mean even the test bullets that were ostensibly fired from Sirhan's gun. They couldn't even match those bullets back to Sirhan's gun. And like I said, to me, the obvious explanation is because none of them came from Sirhan's gun.
Yes.
If Sirhan were truly firing blanks, it would make sense that none of the bullets would match his gun. It would also make sense why the LAPD would then make some phony bullets, because if the other bullets came from two other shooters, and there were at least three shooters in the pantry, I believe I've even found a fourth gun. I can't prove that gun was fired, but I can definitely prove there were at least three guns that were fired in the pantry, and you can read about that in my book. And a fourth gun that was run out of the pantry that may or may not have also been used. Yeah, and even possibly a fifth gun, but I'm getting out of the story. It's just shocking when you see how many. They had 6 different suspects on police radio right after the case, only one of which was Sirhan. They apprehended 3 people at the hotel. I always knew about Sirhan, and I learned about Michael Wayne being apprehended, but there was even a third guy who was apprehended at the hotel under suspicion of being involved. I mean, there was so much evidence of conspiracy, and that's why it was so completely irresponsible, not to mention dishonest, of the LAPD to shut down conspiracy investigations even before they started. Like literally on police radio as these suspects are being announced, Inspector Powers gets on the air and he goes, "Hey, wait a minute, we got a suspect in custody, and Rayford Johnson said there was only one person shooting, and we don't want to get people started on a big conspiracy." Well, that was a misrepresentation of what Rayford Johnson said, because Rayford Johnson said well, once I saw one gun, I didn't look around for any others. I mean, if somebody's shooting a gun, where are your eyes going to go? Are you going to look around? No, your eyes are going to stay hyper-focused on that gun barrel to make sure it doesn't point your way. That is human nature, and that's what the conspirators were counting on. It was staged like a magic trick. Pull focus. That's what you do. And if you put a gun in a room, no one is going to look anywhere else. And there was one witness who actually did look somewhere else because she had been in the Chinatown parade where Kennedy, firecrackers had been thrown at them. And when the sound of the crackling went off, Kennedy ducked, and she thought, oh, my God, what if those had been bullets? And she's like, if that happens again, what should I look for? And so she'd actually mentally rehearsed how she would prepare for this if it happened again. And what she saw in the pantry was really interesting. You'll have to wait for my book for that.
Oh, believe me, I can't wait to read the book.
Well, thank you. I can't wait to be able to openly talk about it because I hate having to give half a story. I'd much rather tell a whole thing, but that wouldn't be fair to the publisher.
Oh, we absolutely hope to have you back on in November to talk specifically about the information that's in the book.
Well, that would be cool. That would be cool. Yeah.
But for right now, we have a few questions emailed to us, and I promised I'd ask you.
Okay.
And the first email wanted to address Sirhan's ideology, mainly the idea that some mainstream sources have said that he was anti-Semitic. Now, the emailer specifically asks, and I'm using his words here, was Sirhan anti-Israel?
to say he's anti-Israel is kind of, how do I want to say? It's like asking somebody in Iraq during the Iraq War if you're anti-American. It's like, well, yeah, when bombs are raining down on your head, you're going to be anti whoever's throwing the bombs at you, right? And that's Sirhan was anti being bombed by Israel, absolutely, because that had happened to his family. He'd lost his older brother Munir, had been killed by the Israelis in the fighting, and that's why his younger brother was named Munir. He was so distraught that his mother feared she better name the next kid Munir to try and cheer Sirhan up because he really missed Munir. And this is an intensely personal thing for him. It's not like he hated Israel, like he was anti-Semitic or something like that, or prejudiced. It's like he had a real good reason for disliking Israel because what they had done to his family. They used to live a middle-class existence. They had a nice little home in a place in Palestine, and then the Arab-Israeli war broke out, and suddenly they were forcibly, they all had to leave that area and were shoved with another 40 families into like one building where their toilet was basically a pit, that they all had to use. Their beds were rolled up clothes in bags. Their food was whatever the UN dropped off every couple of weeks, which was usually like flour and corn oil and water. It's just a horrific existence. He saw arms and limbs hanging from buildings. When he pulled up a bucket of water, there was a severed hand in it. So yes, he was anti-Israel, but again, consider his perspective. If you were there, you'd be anti-Israel too. Let's face it. And the Israels would be anti-Palestinians for the same reason. I'm not trying to take sides here, but I'm saying yes, he had a visceral response to that. Now that said, as I said, in my book, I'm going to prove that Sirhan is actually completely innocent, that he was hypnotized to perform an act of distraction without having any knowledge that he was involved in any kind of an assassination plot. And there's even a parallel to this from a fairly recent event that I talk about in the book, and I can't wait to talk about that too. And in fact, that particular story showed up on the show Deception. So if people watched Deception this year, it's a TV show on NBC, they use the story that's in my book as one of their storylines because it's a great way to stage a murder. Let's put it that way. But again, if Sirhan didn't know he was participating in a murder, how could he be involved? And so I don't want to really go into his perspective because it's irrelevant.
I understand. And I believe you just partially answered email number 2, which was, Lisa, was Sirhan part of the MK Ultra mind control program?
I believe he was, but MK Ultra is, although that was one of the biggest set of mind control experiments, the one that's more analogous is Artichoke, which preceded MK Ultra. Artichoke used combinations of not only hypnosis but drugs, and I do believe Sirhan may well have been drugged as well as hypnotized. I think that would explain a lot. It also makes it harder to recall memory. If you're only hypnotized, you can often get that memory back. But if you are hypnotized and drugged, it's as if that memory wasn't really recorded. And so it's nearly impossible to recover memory in those cases. And that may be the case with Sirhan. That's a much weaker, argument, and I'll let people make up their own minds. They can see my evidence, but I'm not 100% sure either on the drugs. The hypnosis, yes. Drugs, no. And I talk in there about the Artichoke program because there's a document from the Artichoke program that sounds almost exactly like what happened in the pantry. They pose the question, can a person of, nationality, some foreign nationality, be induced to commit an act of attempted assassination? And I thought the wording was so interesting. It's like, because that's really what Sirhan was induced to look like he was committing, like an attempted assassination. There was nothing about an actual assassination if he's firing blanks. And if he's not firing blanks, let's face it, the bullets would have all matched his gun because the LAPD would have fired his gun and made sure they matched.
Absolutely.
Let's just be clear about that. All right. If they're going to forge bullets, they would have forged them with Sirhan's gun. And the problem is, like I said, if he didn't shoot any of the bullets, that's much harder to do. So, because then they have to make many, many bullets and pieces that all match, so that's a little trickier. And they didn't have that much time. So, anyway, and they didn't have access to Sirhan's gun at the moment, but they could have stolen it years later. And here's the other thing about that. I'm just going to add to that, because I didn't put this in my book, and I wish I had, but the police's explanation for why Sirhan's gun didn't match the bullets is, the police took it out of inventory and fired it and made their own souvenir bullets, and they fired it so often over the years that, that's how the barrel changed, and so it's no longer the same barrel. Every time you fire, the bullets kind of change the barrel a little bit. Well, one, that would have had to be like thousands and thousands of bullets fired. And two, again, if they had access to Sirhan's gun, they would have forged the bullets from Sirhan's gun. That would have made sense. So it's clear they didn't use Sirhan's gun. They didn't have access to Sirhan's gun, and the explanation that they did is just bullshit. And the reason the gun is leaded is because Sirhan had been firing all day at a shooting range, again, not knowing he was later being set up to participate in a conspiracy to kill Robert Kennedy. It's very clear that, in my mind, again, based on the evidence, and the readers will see for themselves, that he had no idea that he was being set up or what he was being set up to do. And in that sense, I think he should be considered totally innocent and should be freed. And I think that's what Robert Kennedy would want. He would not want somebody in jail for a crime they didn't commit, especially for him. You know what I mean? I feel like that's one of the best ways we could honor Robert Kennedy would be to free Sirhan. It's what he would have wanted. He would be incensed that this family who had had so much trauma and came to America in the hopes of escaping that trauma, brought over by a church, thinking they were in good hands, and then one of their own is taken and used in a plot to kill the president. And that didn't just destroy Sirhan's life, that destroyed his whole family's life. I mean, the brothers after that had trouble getting jobs. Munir has spent pretty much his whole life doing very little but trying to free his brother, trying to work with different lawyers over the years, trying to talk to media people when he could. It was the end of the road for all of them. There are no further Sirhans. It's like none of them had children. None of them got married and had children. It was a completely traumatic event for that entire family. And again, when Robert Kennedy was killed, the whole world suffered. And that's horrible because he would have been a great leader. But again, one man's life and another man's life, they are equal to me. And I feel they were both victims. And in fact, I dedicated my book to Robert Kennedy Jr. and Munir Sirhan, two family members who fought to find the truth, been brave enough to look for the truth about what happened, because, anyway, it's very frustrating that it's such a sophisticated magic act that people don't think anybody can think like that. But people do think like that and probably have. And like you said, there was a current event not that long ago that did something similar. That's all I'll say about that.
Okay, well, we'll be sure to read that in the new book, A Lie Too Big to Fail, The Real History of the Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, due out in November. And email number 3, what role, if any, was played by the girl in the polka dot dress?
Very interesting question. Yes. If Sirhan was hypnotized, you don't want your hypnotized patsy walking around the hotel because, what if somebody picks him up and puts him in a car and drives him away before the crime has been committed? Somebody has to be with him at every moment to make sure he doesn't disappear. He needs to be put in the right place. Otherwise, why have him as a patsy? And I believe that was the girl in the polka dot dress's role. Sandy Serrano had been a volunteer for the Kennedy campaign, was sitting at the back entrance of the embassy room on the fire escape. And this, by the way, is not a common place where anybody would go. This is like going backstage somewhere. It's like most people didn't even know you could go there. So she's sitting in a place where no one is expected to be. And this girl in a polka dot dress and a guy in a gold sweater and Sirhan walk up the stairs past Sandy Serrano and into the embassy room. It's about 20 minutes or so before Kennedy comes down to speak. And I'm not sure on the timing. I would have to double check that. I remember it as that, but it could be an hour or 5 minutes. I don't remember. But sometime before Kennedy came down to speak, she saw these 3 people enter. And then shortly after the shooting, she hears what she thinks are some backfires on a car, and may have been backfires on a car or not, because there was a guy with a radio who was standing very near the door where Sandy had gone out to sit down outside. If the guy with the radio is connected to people in the pantry, it's possible she was hearing shots from the pantry, not shots directly, but shots over the guy's radio. But in any case, she hears some sharp reports, and that kind of wakes her up, because she's just sitting there enjoying the night. She's like, something's wrong. And then flying down the stairs comes this girl in a polka dot dress and the guy in the gold sweater, but the third guy is missing because, of course, Sirhan was captured in the pantry and couldn't come back out with them. But all through the night, it's not just Sandy. Oh, and by the way, as the girl runs past Sandy Serrano, the girl is yelling to someone, not to Sandy, to someone else, "We shot him, we shot him." Sandy then asks, "Who did you shoot?" And the girl says, "Senator Kennedy," as she runs off into the black darkness and disappears. All right, so I don't think the girl in polka dot dress shot anybody. I think when she said we shot him, I think she meant our team, we as a group, shot Senator Kennedy. That's what I believe. All through the night, there are witnesses that see this girl and Sirhan, and often the guy or the guy in the gold sweater with Sirhan, or the three of them together. But somebody is almost always with Sirhan. It's very rare that Sirhan is spotted entirely alone. He is spotted alone a few times, but I have to believe the girl and the guy were probably within eye shot of him and keeping an eye on him because, again, he's too valuable. You can't just let this guy wander around by himself. In fact, I think I know who got him to the Ambassador Hotel, which you can also read about in my book, because he talks about how he just walked from the Kuchel headquarters down to the Ambassador Hotel, but I think somebody walked with him, and I think I know who it was. So, anyway, I'll say that.
And I cannot wait again.
Oh.
But before we end tonight, I want to ask you a sort of open-ended question. Now, you seem to have a real admiration for RFK, as do I, and you've spent so many hours on his life and on this case. What has he taught you?
Oh, boy. To be compassionate to other people. And again, to really treat everybody as an equal, to not speak down to people or not classify people as ever less than. I think if there's one lesson that I get from Bobby Kennedy, it's that. It's to understand that everybody has their own private grief and their own personal struggles you may never see on the surface, but they're there. Everybody has them, and that we have to cut each other a lot of slack. And that we have to work together, that our problems are really big. There's nothing one person can solve. It's going to take enormous swaths of humanity to fix, global climate change. We're going to have to adapt very rapidly in a hurry to a desert planet if we don't change our ways. I mean, seriously, that's where we're headed. And these are big problems. And we have to learn to focus on the things that really matter and let a lot of petty disagreements go. And I know a lot of people think gun control is huge, and I'm not a gun person myself. I don't like guns. I've never used a gun. I don't ever want to use a gun. Maybe at a firing range once I would do it just to see, but I would not spend my life fighting for gun control. I think the issues are even bigger than that. You know what I mean? It's not that it's not important. I just think in the order of importance, global warming has to be way up there. Pollution, these are the things that are literally destroying our planet. I read a report saying the seas will be devoid of fish in 2040. That's just a few years from now. If the seas are devoid of fish, that means the seas are dead, because without fish, the whole food chain collapses. There's nothing. That means we just have dead cesspools of water. That's not the kind of planet I grew up in. It's not the one I want to leave everybody else's children. I don't have children, but I would like to think the world's going to continue past my lifetime, and at the rate we're going, it's not a given. It's really not a given. And I know that Bobby Kennedy Jr., has been close to the environment and environmental issues all his life, because he gets it. He gets that of all the issues on the planet, there's one that really affects us all, and it does not discriminate against rich or poor. And, the rich are going to suffer as much as the poor in this case. They may live a little longer, but if the seas are dead, that affects the rich people too. It's like, this affects all of us, and we've got to find a way to come together and fix it. It's bigger than war. It's bigger than war. There are many more people will die from this than will die in any war that's going on right now. And I've always been anti-war, but this is bigger than war. And so, yeah, I hope people think about that.
Thank you very much for that. And with that said, I'd like you to provide everyone one more time with the release information on the book. And if anyone out there would like to follow you and like to follow your work online, how can they do so?
Well, definitely follow me on Twitter. I am Lisa Pease, at Lisa Pease, Pease, like please without the L. It's probably where I post the most. On my, I have a Facebook page, but aside from the anniversary, I don't like to talk about the Kennedy cases there too much. That's more where I talk about my fun music or, pretty picture I saw or something like that. But Twitter's where I kind of let it all hang out, and if I see a good article, I'm more likely to post it there than anywhere else. So go there. I still have a realhistoryarchives.blogspot.com blog, so if there's something important that I want to get out there at some length, I will put it on my blog. I don't blog there very often, but there's several years' worth of articles there. People should feel free to dig through. If you Google my name and go to Google News, you can read a lot of my articles at Consortium News before Robert Perry died. I'm so sorry. He was such a good journalist, one of the few who really cared about telling the truth, and such a loss to the world that he's gone. Consortium News is still there, but I've written a number of pieces there. And, of course, my book is already available for pre-sale on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Amazon is not the only vendor on the planet. You can also pre-order if you want to buy blue from barnesandnoble.com. But the book is called A Lie Too Big to Fail. But I would say search for Lisa Pease, because if you search for A Lie Too Big to Fail, it's too many small words and it won't come up. You really have to search my name, Lisa Pease, to get to the book. And I hope you will buy it, and I hope we can all have a really big conversation, because the book is not just about the RFK case by any stretch of the imagination. It's really kind of a swath of history of that time, because everything that was happening around the investigation and the assassination had some bearing on what happened. And, I talk about some present events that shed light on past events. So I think people will be really astonished by the scope of what I managed to cover. Amazon lists it as 678 pages, although I got a copy from the publisher that looks closer to 600, so I don't know if that's, I don't know how those things are calculated, but it's somewhere between like 550 and 678 pages, I would say. It's a big book, but it's got a lot in it, and I hope people will read it. And thank you.
Oh, gosh, no. Thank you so much for spending the evening with us, and we'll have the links to everything on MidnightRiderNews.com, and we look forward to having you back on in November or December to specifically discuss all these exciting issues that you've brought up in A Lie Too Big to Fail, the real history of the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy.
Oh, thank you so much. That would be awesome.
Have a good night, Lisa.
Okay, you too.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm St. Patrick, and we'll be right back.
This is Carmine Savastano, author of Two Princes and a King, a concise review of 3 political assassinations. For more on CIA involvement in the Lee Harvey Oswald story, the truth about Priscilla Johnson McMillan, and the JFK assassination myths, listen to episode 58 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
Although counterfactual history is growing in popularity, we can't really play the what-if game with any kind of assuredness. Longtime friends of mine will always tell you that I liked Robert Kennedy more than John Kennedy, and I'm a real admirer of John Kennedy. But I always thought that Bobby had something that you just cannot put into words, something almost indescribable. You meet people like this in life, but rarely are they politicians. Hopefully for all of you, you'll marry someone like this in life. But there are people that cross your path in ways that just seem genuine. And sometimes I think the genuine just doesn't seem like a large enough word. This is an era of hyperbole, after all, and we're all concerned with the greatest, or the worst, or the most popular, or the least liked, or the most admired, and on and on and on. We push people to the highs and lows with way too much regularity. When you hate someone, you snap that they should die. And if you doubt that that's the case, read some political comments on Facebook for about an hour. And when we like a figure, we want to make them president, say The Rock or even Oprah Winfrey. The heights and the depths to which we push people and push things, it's just too much. It's too far. Genuine doesn't really fall into any of those because genuine is real. Real, but not easily quantified. It's just a gut feeling that you get, but it's also what keeps your eyes and ears open to someone. And I find Robert F. Kennedy fascinating. When I see clips, I always watch his face because it's very telling. His tone of voice is also revealing. And as Lisa said tonight, there's a self-deprecating humor there. But he isn't soft. We've all seen him grill Jimmy Hoffa and other leaders. And his toughness was admirable, although I've never believed it was for show. I used to watch him reach out his hand in a way that never seemed political. When Bill Clinton, for example, reaches his arms out to hug someone, I always feel like he knows exactly where the cameras are placed. With Bobby Kennedy, I always felt like he was reaching out to that person in a human way, as he was reaching out for a problem to solve, a mountain to move, or a candle to light. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
You can contact St. Patrick by email at midnightridernews@gmail.com. Join us on Facebook at Midnight Rider News Show. Follow St. Patrick on Twitter at MWN_St. Patrick. We are LinkedIn at S.T.Patrick. And don't forget to follow Midnight Rider News on your YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and many of your favorite podcast providers. This has been a production of MidnightRiderNews.com and St. Patrick. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved. We'll see you next time, and be good to the night.